It began as a quiet exchange outside a sealed archive room inside Windsor Castle, one that palace aides refused to explain and senior courtiers quickly tried to bury. But when King Charles emerged pale, silent, and visibly shaken, the message was impossible to ignore. Something deeply personal had been confirmed. Queen Elizabeth's private diaries were not going to him. They were passing to Princess Anne. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the confirmation came not through a public statement, not through a family gathering, and not through the soft language of grief, but through the cold precision of executors handling Queen Elizabeth II's private papers. These were not ordinary records. They were not ceremonial notes prepared for historians, nor polished reflections meant for palace archives. They were believed to be the late Queen's most personal writings. The quiet pages, where duty, disappointment, fear, and faith may have existed without the armor of protocol. And for King Charles, the revelation that those pages had passed to Anne was said to have landed like a blow no crown could soften. For years, Charles had lived beneath the shadow of his mother's judgment, shaped by her silence, measured against her discipline, and prepared for a throne that seemed always near yet impossibly distant. As monarch and as Elizabeth's eldest son, he may have believed that some access to her private reflections would naturally fall to him. Not because he wished to exploit them, but because they were, in some deeply human way, the last remaining conversation between a son and the mother who had defined his life. Yet the executor's confirmation reportedly made one thing unmistakably clear. Elizabeth's final confidence had not been placed in the king. It had been placed in the Princess Royal. That decision changed the emotional temperature inside the palace. A matter that could have been treated as paperwork suddenly became something heavier, almost sacred. The diaries were described by those familiar with royal private papers as containing reflections on duty, family strain, succession anxieties, and the private burdens Elizabeth carried in her final years. If true, they were not merely notebooks. They were a record of what the late Queen saw, what she endured, and what she chose never to say aloud. And that is why their transfer mattered so deeply. Whoever guarded those diaries would guard not only Elizabeth's memory, but the hidden architecture of her final judgment. Charles's reaction, according to palace whispers, was not fury. It was heartbreak. There was no suggestion of shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no royal tantrum echoing through corridors. The pain was quieter and therefore more devastating. It was the pain of a son realizing that his mother may have trusted someone else to protect the truths he longed to understand. It was the ache of knowing that Elizabeth, even from beyond the grave, had made a choice that separated family love from royal duty. She had not chosen the highest title. She had chosen the person she believed would keep faith with silence. And that person was Anne. Iron-willed, unsentimental, and famously impossible to bend, the Princess Royal had always been regarded as the child who understood Elizabeth's code without needing it explained. Anne did not chase emotional comfort. She did not seek public softness. She carried duty like a second skin, and in that discipline, the late Queen may have seen the safest pair of hands in the family. To some inside the institution, Anne's appointment was not an insult to Charles. It was a final act of protection. To others, it was a devastating signal that Elizabeth had seen weakness around the throne and built a wall around her private truth before anyone could reach it. That is why the diaries became more than paper. They became the final voice of the woman who had ruled for 70 years, the mother who had watched her children fracture under the weight of monarchy, and the sovereign who understood that the crown survives only when certain truths are guarded with ruthless care. Charles may wear the crown, but Anne now held the pages that could explain the Queen behind it. And inside that painful division, the House of Windsor found itself facing a question no one dared ask too loudly. What did Elizabeth know? What did she write? And why did she decide Charles should not be the first to hold it? But the true wound was not simply that Elizabeth's diaries had gone to Anne, it was what those diaries may have revealed about why Charles was passed over. For decades, Queen Elizabeth's private diaries were treated as untouchable, locked away from politics, gossip, and the restless appetite of the modern royal machine. They were not public records. They were not palace briefing notes. They were the quiet record of a sovereign who watched everything, absorbed everything, and rarely explained herself. Now, those pages had become the most dangerous inheritance in the House of Windsor. Reports suggest that Elizabeth's diaries carried a significance no official file could match. A government paper can show what was decided. A court circular can show what was performed. A palace statement can show what the institution wished the world to believe. But a private diary, written away from the noise of microphones and public ceremonies, can reveal something far more powerful. What the monarch truly feared, what she privately questioned, and what she chose to endure without complaint. That is why these pages were never just family keepsakes. They were the most intimate royal archive left behind by the woman who had spent 70 years mastering the art of silence. For King Charles, that reality made the executor's decision even more painful. He may have understood, better than anyone, that Elizabeth's public face was only one part of her reign. Behind the calm voice, the measured gestures, and the relentless devotion to duty, there had been a woman watching crisis after crisis pass through the palace. Constitutional tension, family rupture, public grief, scandal, betrayal, and the slow, painful transition toward a monarchy she knew would one day belong to her son. If the diaries contained even fragments of those reflections, then they were not merely historical material. They were emotional evidence. They were the private pulse beneath the public crown, and that is what made Anne's selection so powerful. Executors allegedly made clear that the diaries were governed not by Charles's personal expectation, but by Elizabeth's private instruction. The distinction was brutal. As king, Charles could preside over the institution. He could receive state papers, meet ministers, grant honors, and continue the ancient rhythm of monarchy. But these diaries belonged to something older and more personal than the throne itself. They belonged to Elizabeth's own judgment. And if she had chosen Anne to guard them, then even the sovereign had to step back before the final will of the woman who had worn the crown before him. The symbolic weight was impossible to ignore. Whoever controlled the diaries controlled the most delicate layer of Elizabeth's legacy. Not the official legacy already praised in speeches and carved into national memory, but the hidden legacy. The doubts she never confessed, the disappointments she never displayed, the private warnings she may have written when the family appeared most fragile. In palace terms, that kind of inheritance is more dangerous than jewels, estates, or titles. Jewels can be displayed. Estates can be managed. Titles can be announced. But a diary can change the meaning of a reign. A diary can turn silence into testimony. Charles may have believed the diaries naturally belonged under the authority of the reigning monarch, especially because the crown had now passed into his hands. Yet this was the wound inside the wound. Elizabeth had separated the crown from the confidence. She had drawn a line between constitutional power and personal trust. And on the other side of that line stood Anne, the daughter who had never needed to be reassured, never needed to be flattered, and never mistook emotion for entitlement. Her appointment suggested that Elizabeth wanted someone disciplined, discreet, and emotionally unsentimental enough to protect the pages from pressure, curiosity, and palace factionalism. That is why the diaries became a sacred trust, not a family possession. They were no longer simply the writings of a mother, nor even the reflections of a queen. They became a sealed covenant between Elizabeth and the one royal she believed would keep the firm before the family, duty before comfort, and silence before self-interest. And once that truth settled over the palace, Charles could no longer tell himself this was a clerical decision or a misunderstanding buried inside legal language. The executors had not improvised. Anne had not seized. The papers had followed a path Elizabeth herself had prepared. And once the executors explained the late Queen's instructions, Charles was forced to confront a devastating possibility that his mother had made this decision long before her death. The confirmation reportedly came through carefully worded legal channels, not emotional family discussion. There was no grand announcement, no public ceremony, no comforting explanation prepared for the king, just a sealed instruction, a list of conditions, and the quiet authority of the late Queen's own hand. In that moment, Elizabeth's voice seemed to return from beyond the grave, and it named Anne as the keeper. That was what made the moment so chilling. It did not arrive with drama on the surface. It arrived through procedure, through language chosen to remove feeling, through the kind of formal process the House of Windsor has always used when emotion becomes too dangerous to handle directly. Executors allegedly presented a final instruction connected to Elizabeth's personal writings, and within that instruction, the message was unmistakable. Access would be limited, control would be protected, and responsibility would rest with Princess Anne, not temporarily, not symbolically, but deliberately. For Charles, the wording itself may have been the cruelest part. A son might have hoped for softness, for explanation, for some final gesture that said the decision was not personal. But monarchy rarely gives comfort in the language people need most. It gives rules, it gives seals, it gives conditions. And in this case, those conditions reportedly placed Elizabeth's private legacy beyond the reach of the very man who had inherited her crown. Charles could command ceremony, receive red boxes, and carry the title his mother had carried for 70 years. Yet the private pages that might have explained her deepest thoughts were not placed into his care. That distinction cut through the palace like a blade, because it suggested that Elizabeth had not confused position with protection. She knew Charles was king. She knew he was her eldest son. She knew the emotional weight he would carry after her death. And still, according to the whispers surrounding the executor's decision, she chose Anne. The choice reflected a trust built over decades. Anne's discipline, Anne's silence. Anne's refusal to bend beneath sentiment, pressure, or palace politics. Where others might search for comfort inside the diaries, Anne would search for duty. Where others might wonder what could be revealed, Anne would know what must remain sealed. The palace is said to have treated the matter with extreme sensitivity because it touched two fragile worlds at once: private grief and public legacy. If handled carelessly, it could look like a rejection of Charles. If hidden too aggressively, it could provoke even darker speculation. And if the diaries were ever discussed too openly, Elizabeth's most intimate reflections could become ammunition in the very kind of family struggle she had spent her reign trying to contain. So the institution did what it always does when the truth is too sharp. It lowered its voice. It narrowed the circle. It wrapped pain in protocol. Different interpretations have begun to form around why Elizabeth made the decision. Some suggest she may have wanted to protect Charles from passages too painful for a grieving son and weakened king to absorb. Perhaps she had written honestly about the pressures surrounding his succession, about the burdens of his personal history, or about doubts that were never meant to become wounds. Others believe her concern was not Charles's pain, but the palace's stability. In that reading, Elizabeth feared the diaries being misread, politicized, selectively leaked, or pulled into internal battles over influence, reputation, and control. Either way, Anne's appointment transformed her into the guardian of the unpublished Elizabeth. Not the queen of balcony appearances and national broadcasts. Not the figure preserved in portraits, ceremonies, and careful public memory. But Elizabeth the mother, Elizabeth the monarch, Elizabeth the strategist, Elizabeth the witness. The woman who saw what others missed. The woman who understood the difference between loyalty and performance. The woman who may have written down what the palace itself could never say aloud. And that is why the instruction carried such devastating force. It did not merely pass diaries from one hand to another. It created a wall between the king and his mother's final private truth. It told Charles that love and trust were not always measured by title, birth order, or inheritance. Sometimes they were measured by silence. Sometimes by restraint. Sometimes by the person strong enough to protect a secret even when the family begged to see it. But if the instruction was painful, what made it unbearable was the growing belief that Elizabeth's diaries contained warnings about the very reign Charles was now struggling to hold together. Insiders whisper that Charles did not fear the diaries because they contained scandal. He feared them because they contained judgment. Not the judgment of newspapers, not the judgment of Parliament, not the judgment of public opinion, but the private judgment of his mother, written in her own hand across the most fragile years of the family's history. That was the danger hidden inside the pages. Reports suggest the diaries were not feared because they might expose one explosive secret, but because they may have carried a lifetime of quiet observations, written with the cold accuracy of a woman who had watched her family rise, fracture, recover, and fracture again. Elizabeth did not need loud condemnation to make her thoughts powerful. A single sentence from her hand, even gently written, could weigh more heavily than 1,000 headlines. And for Charles, that possibility cut deeper than any public criticism ever could. Because this was not about politics. It was personal. It was a son wondering what his mother truly believed when no advisor was present, no camera waited, and no palace statement softened the edges of the truth. Insiders believe the diaries may have included reflections on Charles's readiness, his burdens, his sensitivity, and the long emotional road that led him toward the throne. Elizabeth had watched him wait for decades. She had seen his triumphs, his mistakes, his private storms, and his struggle to balance personal longing with public duty. If those thoughts were written down, then Charles was not merely being denied access to paper. He was being denied access to the most honest version of his mother's understanding of him. That is what made Anne's custody so unsettling. It suggested that somewhere inside those pages, Elizabeth may have recorded judgments too delicate, too painful, or too politically dangerous to be left in the hands of anyone guided by emotion. The diaries were rumored to touch on the great pressures of the modern crown: marriage, succession, public trust, family loyalty, and the future of a monarchy forced to survive in an age that questions everything. Perhaps Elizabeth wrote about the difficult balance Charles would face as king. Perhaps she considered the role Camilla would occupy beside him. Perhaps she measured William's future with the same careful restraint that had defined her reign. And perhaps, in Anne, she saw the one person steady enough to guard those reflections without turning them into weapons. Nothing about this could be stated with certainty, and that uncertainty only made the fear sharper. No one outside the smallest circle could truly know what the diaries contained. Yet in royal life, whispers often become powerful not because they are confirmed, but because they are believable. The House of Windsor is built on silence, but silence creates its own shadows. The less the palace said, the more the question grew. What had Elizabeth written that made Anne's guardianship so necessary? For Charles, the wound was not simply that Anne might know more than he did. It was that Anne might know what had to remain sealed. She might know which truths would wound him, which memories would complicate his reign, which private reflections could shift the way history understood his mother's final years. That placed her in a position of quiet authority no title could fully explain. Charles had inherited the throne, but Anne had inherited the restraint. He carried the crown in public. She carried the silence in private. And yet Charles was not the villain in this drama. He was its most wounded figure. An aging king, already carrying the strain of duty, was now confronted by the one thing monarchy could not command: his mother's final emotional trust. He could issue orders, host audiences, and stand at the center of the institution, but he could not force open the private mind of Elizabeth II. That was the tragedy. The crown had given him power, but it had not given him certainty. It had made him sovereign, but it had not made him the keeper of her deepest truth. So the diaries became a symbol of a cruel royal lesson. Sometimes inheritance is not measured by what is handed down, but by what is withheld. A jewel can be placed in a vault. A title can be announced. A property can be transferred. But a mother's private judgment is something else entirely. To be denied, it is to stand before a closed door and wonder whether love, disappointment, protection, and warning are all locked on the other side. And then came the moment that turned private heartbreak into a palace power shift. Anne refused to treat the diaries as family property. Princess Anne did not celebrate. She did not soften. She did not use Elizabeth's trust as a weapon in public. Instead, according to palace whispers, she did what she has always done when the crown trembles. She closed the door, tightened the rules, and made it clear that sentiment would not be allowed to override duty. That was the moment the diaries stopped being a private family sorrow and became a matter of royal control. Anne's response, according to those familiar with the atmosphere around the palace, was not emotional triumph. It was not revenge. It was not a sister stepping over a wounded brother. It was something colder, older, and far more powerful. The discipline of a royal who understood that Elizabeth's final wishes were not suggestions to be softened by grief. They were instructions. And instructions, once left by the late queen, were to be obeyed. Anne reportedly accepted the diaries as a solemn responsibility, not a personal prize. There was no sense that she wanted to possess Elizabeth's private voice for herself. Instead, her first concern was said to be protection. Protection from leaks. Protection from emotional pressure. Protection from factional interpretation. Protection from anyone who might open those pages not to understand Elizabeth, but to use her. That difference mattered. In the House of Windsor, the most dangerous weapon is not always a public accusation. Sometimes it is a private sentence, pulled from context and released at exactly the wrong moment. So Anne moved with the kind of quiet force that has always defined her. Reports suggest she insisted on strict access rules, formal archival safeguards, and continued executor oversight. Every request would have to be justified. Every handling of the material would have to be controlled. Every possible breach would be treated not as family curiosity, but as institutional danger. Palace aides, stunned by the severity of her position, began referring to the arrangement as the Windsor Silence Protocol, a doctrine built around one brutal principle. Elizabeth's diaries would not become a battlefield. The protocol reportedly protected the writings from 4 threats at once. First, leaks, because one careless disclosure could turn private grief into a national frenzy. Second, emotional pressure, because Charles's heartbreak, however real, could not be allowed to override Elizabeth's written command. Third, factional influence, because every royal household has its loyalties, its fears, and its quiet ambitions. And fourth, selective disclosure, because the greatest betrayal would not be publishing the diaries in full, but using one fragment to distort the whole woman. Anne's posture reinforced what many inside the palace had long believed. She was the guardian of the flame, not the flame of glamour, not the flame of popularity, the flame of duty. She had watched her mother carry the monarchy through decades of public storms, and she understood the price of survival. Elizabeth had not preserved the crown by indulging every emotional demand placed before her. She had preserved it by knowing when to speak, when to wait, and when to lock the door. Anne, in this moment, became the living extension of that same discipline. Charles, according to whispers, may have sought clarification, perhaps limited access, perhaps reassurance that the decision was not meant to wound him. And in human terms, the request would have been understandable. He was not only the king, he was Elizabeth's son. A son grieving the mother whose approval had shaped his entire life. But Anne's answer, as the story is told, remained bound to the document rather than the emotion surrounding it. She could feel the pain and still refuse to bend. She could love her brother and still obey her mother. That was why aides reportedly saw Anne's firmness as brutal but necessary. Brutal because it deepened Charles's sense of exclusion. Necessary because any exception would weaken the very trust Elizabeth had placed in her. If Anne allowed grief to rewrite the rules, then the diaries would no longer be protected by principle. They would be vulnerable to every future plea, pressure, and palace maneuver. The line had to be drawn once, sharply, and without apology. And so the conflict became heartbreak against duty. Charles represented the ache of family, the longing to know, the wounded son standing before a locked chamber of memory. Anne represented the command of legacy, the burden of restraint, the daughter chosen to protect a truth even from those who most desperately wanted it. Neither side was simple, neither side was painless. But inside the monarchy, pain has never been enough to cancel duty. That is what made Anne's role so unforgiving. She was not acting against Charles. She was acting for Elizabeth. Every rule she tightened, every request she slowed, every silence she enforced was framed as loyalty to the late Queen's exact intention. And if that loyalty wounded her brother, then the wound itself became part of the cost. In the House of Windsor, the firm comes before the family. And Anne, more than anyone, had been trusted to remember that when everyone else forgot. But Anne's refusal did more than protect the diaries, it exposed a deeper divide. Inside the family over who truly understood Elizabeth's final vision for the monarchy. While Charles reportedly struggled with the emotional blow, Prince William saw something colder and more strategic unfolding. To him, the diaries were not merely a mother's private writings. They were a map of the monarchy his grandmother had fought to preserve, a map now placed not in the hands of the reigning king, but in the hands of the one royal who had never confused love with weakness. For William, the meaning of Anne's appointment was impossible to ignore. He had grown up beneath Elizabeth's reign, watching his grandmother turn restraint into power and silence into a shield. He understood that she rarely acted by accident, especially when it came to the future of the crown. So when reports suggested her private diaries had been placed under Anne's protection, William did not see rebellion. He did not see an insult to his father. He saw design. He saw the final movement of a monarch who had spent her life preparing the institution to survive beyond emotion, beyond scandal, beyond the personal wounds that could destroy weaker families. That is why William's role in this drama became so important. He was not simply a grandson watching a family disagreement. He was the heir watching the next law of kingship being written in silence. The Diaries, according to Palace Whispers, may have contained lessons about succession, endurance, public trust, and the brutal discipline required to protect a monarchy under pressure. If Elizabeth had written about the future, then William knew those pages were not just about the past. They were a warning, a guide, a sealed inheritance of wisdom that had to be guarded before it could ever be understood. And in Anne, William may have recognized the one royal capable of doing exactly that. She was not trying to become more powerful. She was not chasing influence, attention, or public praise. In fact, that was precisely what made her authority so strong. Anne's power came from her refusal to perform it. She enforced Elizabeth's wishes without speeches, without emotion, without any attempt to make herself the center of the story. To William, that restraint would have carried enormous weight. It showed him that real guardianship is not loud, it is disciplined, it is lonely. It is sometimes misunderstood by the very people it protects. This was where the emotional divide inside the palace deepened. Charles may have felt isolated, not because his son had turned against him, but because the younger generation appeared to understand the logic of procedure more easily than the pain of exclusion. William could love his father and still see why Anne had to hold the line. Catherine, according to the tone of Palace Whispers, may have quietly supported the dignity of preserving Elizabeth's wishes exactly as they were left. Not as a punishment, not as a family judgment, but as an act of respect for the woman who had carried the crown longer than anyone else in modern royal memory. The phrase that began to define the moment was simple and merciless: duty over blood. It sounded cold, but in the Windsor world, it was the old law beneath everything. Elizabeth had lived by it. Anne had inherited it, and William, slowly and painfully, was being forced to study it as the future king. The Diaries became a symbolic bridge between three generations. Elizabeth, who wrote the hidden truths, Anne, who guarded them, and William, who would one day inherit the burden those truths were meant to protect. Charles stood painfully in the middle, crowned but wounded, sovereign but not fully included in the secret architecture his mother left behind. That was what made the situation so heartbreaking. It was no longer only about Charles being denied access to his mother's private words. It was about the monarchy quietly shifting around him. Anne's custody of the Diaries did not weaken the crown, it strengthened the line of discipline Elizabeth had built. William's understanding of that fact gave the moment a sharper edge, because it suggested that the future of the monarchy might depend not on emotional reconciliation, but on obedience to the late Queen's final safeguards. In that sense, the Diaries became more than a family archive. They became a test. Could Charles accept that the crown he inherited came with limits imposed by the very woman who gave it to him? Could William learn from the wound without deepening it? Could Anne remain loyal to Elizabeth without appearing cruel to her brother? Every answer carried risk, because every choice revealed something about the kind of monarchy that would survive after Elizabeth. One built on comfort, or one built on control. And as William began to understand the meaning of Anne's appointment, Charles was forced into the most painful realization of all. Elizabeth may have trusted Anne because she knew Anne would say no to him. Reports suggest the king's reaction was not explosive. It was quieter than that, worse than that. Those close to the household describe a man wounded by something no crown could. Protect him from the feeling that his mother's final confidence had passed around him, not through him. For Charles, the Diaries were not just papers. They were the last conversation he never got to have. That was the heartbreak at its most raw. Not public, not theatrical, not something that could be reduced to headlines or palace briefings. It lived in the space between expectation and reality, between what a son believes he is owed and what a monarch is allowed to receive. Charles had waited a lifetime to inherit the crown, but no one prepares a king for the moment he realizes that the most important inheritance was never meant to be his. And in that realization, something shifted. Not in the institution, not in the line of succession, but inside him. He was grieving on two levels at once: the loss of his mother and the possibility that she had chosen not to share her deepest reflections with him. That dual grief created a silence far heavier than anger could ever be. Anger demands a response. Silence offers nothing. It simply sits there, unmovable, forcing the one who carries it to question everything they thought they understood. Reports suggest that those closest to the king noticed the change not in what he said, but in what he did not say. Conversations shortened. Questions lingered. Moments that should have passed quietly began to carry an emotional weight that could not be explained aloud. His physical vulnerability only intensified the strain. Already burdened by illness, already navigating the demands of a reign that had begun under immense pressure, Charles was now forced to absorb a personal wound that had no remedy. The crown could not shield him from it. The institution could not soften it. Even time, which heals most things, could not fully reach a wound built on unanswered questions. Because the truth was simple and devastating. He could never ask Elizabeth what she meant. He could never hear her explain why Anne had been chosen. The final decision had been made in silence, and that silence was now permanent. The palace, aware of the emotional sensitivity surrounding the issue, avoided public acknowledgement. There would be no statement clarifying the matter, no carefully phrased reassurance, no attempt to frame the decision in comforting terms. To speak about it openly would risk turning private grief into public spectacle, and the monarchy has always feared that transformation more than anything. So the matter remained contained, discussed only in whispers, carried only by those close enough to feel its impact. Anne, throughout it all, remained steady, not cold, not indifferent, but immovable. She understood the pain. She could see it in her brother's posture, in the questions he could not quite bring himself to ask directly. And yet she did not bend, because to bend would be to break the very trust Elizabeth had placed in her. Reports suggest Charles may have asked carefully, indirectly, whether Anne had read certain passages, whether their mother had written about him, whether there was anything he should know. But Anne's answers, if they came at all, were said to be measured, controlled, and incomplete. And that was what made her silence so powerful. Not because it concealed scandal, but because it confirmed the existence of something too important to be shared freely. In that silence, Charles was left to confront the possibility that the most honest version of his mother's thoughts would remain forever just out of reach. That her final reflections on his life, his choices, his readiness, and his future as king would stay locked behind a duty he could not override. The tragedy of the moment was not loud. It did not erupt into conflict. It settled into the quiet structure of the monarchy, where personal pain is absorbed and transformed into discipline. Charles continued his role. He fulfilled his duties. He stood before the nation as king. But beneath that continuity, there was a fracture that could not be repaired, only carried. The crown demands obedience, even from those who bleed for it. And in that demand, Charles's heartbreak became something deeper than personal loss. It became a royal sacrifice. But just when the palace believed the matter could be contained, whispers began spreading that Elizabeth's diaries did not simply explain the past, they pointed toward the future. In the end, the diaries did not pass to the loudest voice, the highest title, or the most wounded heart. They passed to the royal who could be trusted to keep them silent. And that may be the final lesson Elizabeth left behind. The monarchy survives not because every truth is spoken, but because some truths are guarded until history is ready to understand them. That realization settled slowly, but once it did, it changed everything. The diaries were no longer a source of tension alone. They became Elizabeth's final act of control over her legacy, a deliberate decision that extended her influence beyond her lifetime. Even in absence, she had shaped the future. Even in silence, she had defined the boundaries of power. Reports suggest that within the palace, this was understood not as a personal slight, but as a sovereign's final safeguard, an invisible structure placed around the truth to ensure it could not be rushed, reshaped, or exploited. At the center of that structure stood Anne, not elevated in ceremony, not transformed into something she had never sought to be, but steady in the role she had always occupied. Protector of memory, enforcer of discipline, guardian of the flame that Elizabeth had carried for 70 years. Anne did not need to explain her authority because it came directly from the one figure no one in the institution could challenge. She was not interpreting Elizabeth's will. She was carrying it out exactly as it had been written. And in doing so, she became something more than a daughter. She became the final line of defense between the monarchy and the vulnerability of its own truth. For Charles, acceptance came not as a single moment, but as a quiet, ongoing surrender to reality. The crown he wore was not a prize he possessed. It was a duty he held, and like all duties within the House of Windsor, it came with limits. The Diaries reminded him of those limits in the most personal way possible. He could lead the institution, represent it, defend it, but he could not claim ownership over everything his mother left behind. Some parts of her legacy were never meant to belong to anyone. They were meant to be protected. William, watching from just behind the present and just ahead of the future, absorbed the lesson in a different way. For him, the moment was not only about loss or exclusion, it was about preparation. He saw clearly what Elizabeth had done. She had separated emotion from responsibility. She had ensured that the most sensitive part of her legacy would be held by the person least likely to misuse it. And in that decision, she had offered a silent instruction to the next king. Survival demands discipline, not comfort. The palace itself adjusted, as it always does, quietly and without announcement. A new order took shape beneath the surface. Elizabeth's written wishes continued to guide decisions, even in her absence. The Windsor Silence Protocol remained active, not as an abstract idea, but as a living rule governing what could be touched, what could be shared, and what must remain sealed. It became clear that the monarchy had not simply endured her passing. It had been structured to carry her voice forward, carefully, deliberately, and without compromise. And so the moral revealed itself with unmistakable clarity. The crown is not a family possession. It is a sacred trust held on behalf of something larger than any one person, any one relationship, any one moment of pain or longing. That truth is what defines the House of Windsor at its core. It is what allows it to survive the storms that would break lesser institutions. And it is what demands sacrifice, even from those who stand at its very center. In that sense, the Diaries were never meant to comfort. They were meant to protect. They were not a reward to be given, but a responsibility to be carried. And as long as they remained sealed under Anne's watch, Elizabeth's final authority would continue to shape the monarchy in ways no public statement ever could. Charles may wear the crown, carry the title, and stand before the world as king. But Anne holds something quieter, something deeper, something far more enduring: the pages that explain the woman who prepared him for it, and the truths she chose to leave behind. And somewhere behind locked archive doors, Elizabeth's final words remain untouched, waiting in silence, guarded by the one daughter who never needed the crown to defend it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.